Well, good morning, everyone, or good evening, depending on where you may be located. My name is David Kiefer, and I'm the CEO of DocAuto. And today we're going to be talking about duplicate emails in WorkSite. Actually, the title of this is dealing with the duplicate emails in WorkSite, but I thought a better title would be Everything You Wanted to Know About Duplicate Emails in WorkSite, but We're Afraid to Ask. And again, some of the core focus that we're going to be talking about today is getting rid of duplicates using WorkSpace Manager, but there are a lot of other aspects of how duplicate emails affect WorkSite, how they're created, how you can monitor what's causing duplicates and other things. So we'll be talking about a few of our other products as well. Just briefly, the agenda. We'll be talking about, very briefly, just some of our solutions and services, and then pretty hideously in-depth discussion of WorkSite and Exchange and how duplicate emails happen, and then how to deal with them, how to get rid of duplicates. There are actually many scenarios where you want to create duplicates because of the various business purposes and, again, some of the limitations of WorkSite. So we'll be talking about that a little bit as well, but again, the core focus is on getting rid of the duplicates. A few housekeeping things. We'll be doing some Q&A at the end. So we have the little Q&A widget there in the GoToWebinar toolbar thingy. So we can do that. We'll do that at the end. And also a recording of this will be made available in the next few days or so on our website. So just briefly talking about the DocAuto Solutions, we have a lot of different products for the WorkSite platform. We've been doing this for coming on 18 years, and WorkSite development is the core line of business that we're in. We have some new SharePoint applications as well that don't really apply to what we're talking about today. So really, WorkSpace Manager is the core application in terms of how we can deal with duplicates in terms of getting rid of them. But the Exchange Importer module can also play an important role in determining when and how duplicates are created or how email can be imported and linked to multiple destinations in WorkSite. Our importing tools, iImport and iImport Desktop, also have the potential to create duplicates. They have some functionality in them that is designed to limit that, but as we'll see in a few minutes, it really is inescapable in many respects to have or not have duplicates within your WorkSite system. The refiling module as well, part of our matter-centric management suite, can deal with either duplicates or messages that are linked to multiple destinations in terms of making sure that a message that has been distilled down, if you will, from multiple instances of a message down to a single physical instance that is instead linked to multiple different folders or workspaces in WorkSite can respect the security of all those locations in WorkSite as well. And then the Helm monitoring platform can also be used to keep track of duplicates and these kinds of things in WorkSite, and also do trend analysis, projections, history reporting, notifications, alerting, and so on, as well as part of a comprehensive duplicate management scheme within the WorkSite platform. Our professional services team has been doing, really in the past couple of years, a horrendous amount of work related to email duplicates. It's a problem that I think a lot of organizations are not really aware of, that they have the issue or how severe the issue may be within their organization. So in addition to all the other services that they provide, the email management strategy and implementation, obviously duplicate management is a core part of that, is a major thing, a major aspect of what they do these days. So let's start to talk a little bit about duplicates in WorkSite. Simple question is, what are the duplicates? Simple answer is that they're physical instances of a message, an email message, that are copies of the exact same message stored more than once in WorkSite. So All of the messages are really something that was sent, generally received by multiple people in exchange, and either the message was imported multiple times over and over again, or it was imported from different users into the same or different targets within WorkSite. But fundamentally, all of the messages are the same. If you exported the messages and did a binary level comparison on them, they would be identical to each other. So all of the message-specific metadata that comes from Exchange, the subject line, sender, recipients, dates, attachments, so on, is the same between all of the different instances of these physical items, so they're duplicates. The interesting thing with duplicates is that they may or may not have the same WorkSite metadata. Right? The WorkSite metadata is independent of what is stored within the physical message itself, so that metadata may or may not be the same. And another important thing that is sort of a user training issue is that because in WorkSite a single file, whether it's an email or any other kind of document or content that is stored in WorkSite, can be linked to and appear to exist within any number of folders in workspaces. A linked item, or if we're talking about items that are linked across databases, an item that has a shortcut to it, those are not what we're considering duplicates, right? They're really a single physical instance of the original message that is being referenced either by the link, if it's in the same database as the folder, or by a shortcut if it's in a different database than the folder within the WorkSite environment. So that is not what we're considering to be a duplicate. So duplicates, just in a simple example here, I've got a bunch of messages and I have 3 duplicates of the first and 4 duplicates of the second. Now notice these are really all the same message. The only difference between them is that the forwards and replies are not considered duplicates. They are different in the Exchange world. They have different what's called the message ID, which is the unique Exchange identifier associated with the message. Obviously the subject lines are different here, and the dates on the message in terms of the sent and received dates will be different on these messages. So forwards and replies are not duplicates of the original message. So a single message that is in multiple folders, again, is not a duplicate, but it has references. In this case, I'm looking at the where used value on an individual message in WorkSite, and I can see that the message is in 5 different locations. Some of these are actually the same workspace, so I can have a message referenced in the same workspace multiple times, but within different folders within the same workspace, and still not be considered a duplicate. Now, it's not possible in general to have a single item, whether it's a message or anything else, referenced or appearing twice within the same folder. However, if it is a shortcut, again, spanning databases, if I have an email that's in database A and the user drags and drops it into a folder that exists in database B, that will create a shortcut item, which is actually a record stored in database B that references the item pointed in database A. Shortcuts in WorkSite are not very intelligent, I'll say, in that they don't really know the item that they're pointing to, and the target item isn't really aware, if you will, of any shortcuts that are referring to it from other databases. So if another user goes and drags and drops that same message into the same target folder in the other database, that will also create another shortcut to that item. So it's the only situation where it's possible to have multiple shortcuts to the same item in the same folder within WorkSite. Again, it's very obscure and somewhat difficult to happen, but it is hypothetically possible. So where did these things come from? How did they get there? The best way to tell is to look at the history events that are recorded for the items within the WorkSite database. Now again, the caveat here is that history events are only recorded on what I'll call well-behaved applications that are pure 3-tier applications that are using the 3-tier architecture of WorkSite. Obviously, one of the great strengths of DocAuto applications is that they are pure 3-tier. All of our applications conform to the WorkSite API models. So anything created by our applications, obviously anything created by the native worksite tools will have history events that indicate the source of the create event is the one that we're looking at. But it is possible. There are a lot of things out there that will get content into worksite. I'll call it importing, but they're not pure three-tier applications, so they may or may not be creating appropriate history events within the worksite database. So you need to be careful with that. But assuming that these things have proper history events, how can they be getting in there? So manual drag and drop by users, probably the oldest method, fairly common. Other manual importing processes, bulk importing tools that are importing content from mailboxes, PST files, or message files that have been exported from Exchange or Outlook and are now existing on network shares. Database consolidations or migrations of content either in whole or in part from one database to another can lead to duplicates. And obviously there are many other situations where duplicates can get created as well. Using the various tools of the worksite platform, the send and file tools in their various incarnations over the last 6 or 7 years, the DocAuto tools over the various years that they've been available. And then there are obviously intentional copying processes by users. Once an email exists in worksite, a user can right-click on it and say copy as new document, boom, they just created a duplicate. And then there are many automated processes that are also going to create duplicates that are creating the duplicates intentionally, but because of some of the limitations of how these tools work, these messages really shouldn't be treated as duplicates when in fact they really appear to be duplicates. So that's another important thing that you need to be careful of. For example, automated processes that are generating pre-bill messages or some kind of automated notification tools. Many of these tools will use an email template that is basically an email message that's saved in a special place, sometimes just the MSG file within the application. That MSG file will have a unique message identifier, but every time that template is cloned and used to create another unique notification message, the message ID may still be the same within all those instances. So I could have tens or hundreds of thousands of messages that have the same message ID, but were actually generated at different times for different purposes, may even have different content. So you really have to be careful about how you analyze this content and not rely solely on the message ID. So for example, here's some actual data that's I think less than a week old from a 500 user firm that's using the native worksite tools that really has only done very minimal email filing. You can see the grand total here is about 23,000 items. That's a very, very small number of duplicates. It's common to see 6- and 7-figure counts on duplicates within the same database in much larger environments. So really this firm, the issue here is that they're not doing a lot of aggressive or what I'll call high production email management within their environment. So looking at the history events, again, the source of the create event in the history, and here you can also see differences between the behaviors in different databases. Database X here has a very small number of user-created duplicates, whereas database Y has a very large number of user-created duplicates. So user behavior will be a strong indicator of how these things are happening. Also, the worksite server does create duplicates, and this can be somewhat ambiguous because the create event will be attributed to the worksite server, but there are really multiple different sources of the native HP tools that are actually behind that process. So that may require additional digging to see what's going on and which process is actually creating those duplicates. But even if you have various deduplication settings turned on, it is not a guarantee by any means that you will not have duplicates and sometimes have a significant number of duplicates. So let's talk about the deduplication settings, right? The purpose of these is to make sure that duplicates don't get created. So there are really two sets of settings here. One is the client-side deduplication settings. These are very common that these will fail. These are the older configuration of settings within the worksite environment. The idea here is that a user drags and drops a message into a folder or somehow imports a message into a particular folder. The client-side deduplication will analyze the contents of that folder and say, hey, there's already an instance or a copy of this message in this folder. I'm not going to import this message over again. Well, the problem there is that there may be copies of the message in the folder that the user, because they're doing the deduplication client-side, does not have security access to detect those particular instances or copies of the message. So the client-side deduplication by design will not detect the duplicates and import another copy of the message even though there actually is one in that folder. Scope as well is another limitation. In general, the scope for those is within the same folder. If you want to look within the same workspace or the same database, there's simply no way that client-side processing can do that fast enough to have a satisfactory user experience and effectively deduplicate at the same time. Server-side settings have changed a lot over the years. So there have been, again, initially the reliance on message ID as the sole key factor for determining whether or not a particular message was a duplicate was the sole factor that the technology relied upon. And the reality is that that's not a safe indicator of whether or not a message is a duplicate and led to false positives on the detection of duplicates and situations where potentially huge volumes of messages that the server thought were already there based on the message ID were actually not being imported because the message IDs were the same, but they were really different physical messages. So that's something that's changed a lot. So there have been changes and improvements to that functionality over the years. The DocAuto technology has changed over the years also to accommodate that. In our older out-in server application, we added support for deduplication by message ID as the initial key value, which we still use, sent date, received date, subject line, and then the various address lines. The issue with those is that address lines can be truncated. We'll talk about that in a second. And subject lines can be edited. Exchange and Outlook actually allow subject lines to be edited any time over the lifespan of a message. So there's something where you can actually have a duplicate message that somebody or some process has edited the subject line, so relying on the subject line is not reliable. VCCs obviously are hidden from certain users, so that's not a safe thing to use. And then the receive date on messages also can change based on downstream processing of the email messages. So the manual and automated operations that are performed by some applications also may not interact appropriately with these settings. So again, there are certain ways that the deduplication works within the worksite server. Basically, if you have server-side deduplication turned on, then that has the effect of ignoring message ID in any document searches. That's a little bit technical, but the end result that will cause is that any kind of application that's trying to use the worksite 3-tier API to search for messages by message ID will fail. So you have to be careful about which combinations of technologies you're using and what the settings are to make sure that the environment is set up appropriately to make sure that whatever approach or whatever technologies are in place are working correctly and harmoniously together. So let's talk a little bit about metadata. I mentioned before that the address information can be used sometimes for checking duplicates. The problem here is that the address information on an email message can have hundreds or even thousands of recipients, so it may be a very long string of text. In the worksite database, that text is truncated to 96 characters. So the issue that you have is that if you try to search for messages in worksite, you may not get all of the messages if you're searching on an address field. Now, the interesting change with WorkSite 8.5 and the introduction of the idle search engine is that idle doesn't actually index the data in the doc master table of the WorkSite database. It's actually indexing the information on the message itself. So if you search for a message using idle that has a particular address and it's the last address of a string of 5,000 addresses, idle will successfully find that message. The issue is if you look up the WorkSite profile for that document, you're not going to see that address in that string because the data has been truncated. So when you open the message, the full message itself, and look at that address field, you will see that the text actually is there. So it's a kind of bizarre result that you see, and really the core issue is that what's happening is that these address fields, the custom 13 through 16 fields, are really only there for convenience for the user if they have a view in DeskSite or FileSite that is showing those address fields as columns within that display. That's really the only time where they're being used. Or in DeskSite, if you have the profile detail pane at the bottom that is showing that information, that's really the only time that that's used, but it's highly likely that that data is being truncated. So you're really not getting an actual picture of the data. The interesting thing also about idle is that it is indexing the text that's in those custom text fields, in addition to actually indexing the text that's in the message itself for the actual addresses. So this sort of begs the question, are the address fields really dual use within WorkSite? Can I put completely different data in those fields and use that for another purpose other than address storage, but really be able to find messages based on address? So the answer is sort of, because again, the limitation here is that the search profiles in WorkSite are geared toward those 4 custom fields, and yes, the search will go to the idle search engine, but with the user's intention is to search on the what I'll call a secondary use of those dual use fields, then they're not going to know or understand that they can also put addresses in there. So you either have to do something goofy with the captions on your search profiles, which again is probably going to confuse most users. So again, in theory it works for dual purposes, but in reality it's just too cumbersome for users. The receive date also is a bizarre thing with email messages. If I send an email message to 20 users, their receive date times may actually be different based on what kind of course it has, what the exchange architecture is within the recipient environment, if they're downstream of virus or malware things, various technologies that will queue and store messages and then forward them later. If there's a particular server down, many things there. So again, the receive date is not necessarily a reliable thing to use for the duplication detection. An interesting thing is that this has been a problem that has been somewhat common over the years. So there is a tool that's available from HP, from their support site, called Message Fix, that will basically grind through your entire WorkSite database and open each message from the message stores, from the document libraries, and update all of the email-specific metadata in the environment based on the real metadata that's coming out of the message itself. Again, it's going to truncate the address information, potentially also the subject line, but that is available if you have issues with corruption or bad data in those fields. All right, so duplicates. Are they a good thing or a bad thing? Most people think they're a bad thing because they're taking up space, they're taking up database data in multiple different tables within the database. If I've got a lot of history events, a lot of security values, then each message may have potentially a huge amount of data in the database, maybe even more than the file share, the size of the file on the file share by itself. Attachments also, if I have a message that's copied to 20 or 50 or 100 people and it's got a 10 meg PowerPoint on it, that's a huge amount of storage. But if I also have people who are editing the message and opening it from a particular place and they think that that's the only instance of the message and they edit the attachment, they're going to have issues potentially with what's going on with those attachments and version control. So some people think having duplicate messages are a good thing. So let's say, for example, I have a message that I want to have in the same folders in an email folder in 3 different workspaces. So I put the email in the first folder, and when I do a search for my email within that particular folder, because the message has metadata that matches this workspace, it's going to appear in the search. If I have the message linked to additional folders in different workspaces, that message will not appear in the stored searches in those workspaces because the metadata is different. Right? The original instance of the message will have the metadata of the first target location in worksite, but the reference will appear within the folders, the link will appear within those folders, but the metadata will not match the metadata on the workspace, so the stored searches will not show that email as present within the workspace. So there are different ways of getting around this. Obviously, you can have stored searches that search based on the scope, i.e. anything that's stored within this workspace, rather than a metadata search that is looking based on the metadata. So there are ways to get around that, but it's going to look weird to users when they see a set of search results and in this example, client matter values are not going to match what they think it should be based on the workspace. So this is an example where we're getting rid of the duplicates, and having links instead can cause problems and confusion among the users. So if I actually do have duplicates, then I have each copy of the message as a separate physical instance. It has the correct and unique metadata of that workspace that it's in, and it will appear within the stored searches. Obviously, the trade-off here is I just ate up 3 times the disk space on the file share and 3 times the data space in the database for all the data associated with those different instances. So this is the balance that you have to decide, and there are ways of treating content in certain kinds of workspaces or at certain times in its lifespan in a particular way, and then switching to a different model at different times, or for content stored in different ways or for different purposes. So you don't have to have an all or nothing sort of approach for these things. So let's look at why we would create duplicates intentionally. This is something we're seeing more and more users wanting to do this. The Exchange Importer module, the DocAuto product, part of our DocAuto server platform, has a number of different places where you can indicate where you want to create duplicates and how you want to create duplicates. The first is what's called in the global filing mode settings, where I can indicate how I want different filing methods to behave. Again, within a job, I can have multiple filing methods that I'll show in a minute, different ways I'm going to attempt to identify where a particular message should be stored in WorkSite based on information I'm extracting from the message, how it's stored, where it's stored, and so on. So if I have different methods, I can determine whether or not I'm going to create links or create separate physical copies of those documents. And then I also have support, the Exchange Importer module also has support for dealing with methods that can actually specifically be applied multiple times to a particular message. Really, the category filing is the primary method here, where I can apply 5 or 10 different categories to a message to indicate specific workspaces where I want that message to be stored. In that configuration, generally you would create a separate physical instance of the document because the user has indicated that they want that document to have the separate multiple instances of metadata. Again, this isn't really a hard and fast rule. These aren't things that would govern all the time, but it's things to consider as part of how you're configuring the application. So in this example here, I've got multiple different filing methods that have been set up, starting with the most precise. The hidden MAPI tags and ePredict will tell me exactly which workspace, which folder I want the message to go into. Subject line tagging is also highly specific, highly reliable, but may also lead to situations where there could be multiple targets identified within the worksite environment. Category mapping also has the support for having multiple tags, and each tag can also resolve to multiple targets. The DocAuto linked folder is very specific, target to target, so that's generally not going to create issues with duplicates. Folder mapping, where I'm looking at metadata on the folder itself, using that to attempt to find a target within WorkSite. Again, that also may yield multiple valid targets for that. Mailbox mapping, getting increasingly generic here in terms of the scope of what we're looking for. I'm basically saying anything associated with a particular mailbox should go to a particular destination WorkSite. Generally that and what we call the default mapping, which is basically everything from this job that's going to a particular target. These are one-to-one mapping methods, although it is hypothetically possible for mailbox mapping to find multiple targets. These are generally considered failover methods within a job configuration. So looking at what we're doing with multi-method filing, again, the way the Exchange Importer module will work is it will attempt to resolve all of these different filing methods for a particular message that it's working on, whether we're on the message, folder, mailbox, or at the beginning of the job for the default. So all of these different targets will be gathered and analyzed as part of each particular filing. And the best one will be used, or all of them will be used, whether or not I have the multi-method filing enabled. So if the multi-method filing is turned off for a particular method, if that method succeeds, then no other methods will be attempted, which is why the order of the methods is very important. Again, for category mapping, I can have multiple targets there because I can apply any number of categories on a message. So it really requires a lot of thought in terms of which tagging methods the users are using in terms of different applications or organizational tools, whether or not they're using categories, folders, and so on. And then the order of these, generally from more specific to more generic, and which ones I'm going to allow to create duplicates. Again, the global filing mode will override whether or not I'm creating physical instances or whether I'm creating links, or whether I want to attempt to use the best possible method and then just bail on anything else as part of that particular type of processing. So again, the methods are attempted in top-down order. Multi-method filing is really whether or not it's participating in multiple methods. And again, any method that fails, it will automatically exclude from that participation pool. Filing to all targets really only applies to categories, but each category, again, may yield multiple valid targets based on the options within the filing method itself. So within the filing method, here, based on how I'm searching for the target within WorkSite, generally I'm extracting the client matter information, that metadata, from the category or the folder, whatever tagging method is being used. This will determine if I'm going to file to all results or skip this method if multiple targets are found. How I'm processing that message when I'm filing to all results will be governed by the global filing mode. Am I creating multiple physical instances, or am I creating links to the single instance in those multiple destinations? So again, here in category, here are the settings to file on all targets and participate in multi-method filing, and I'm extracting the client information out of the category tag. So again, the participate in multi-method filing, if that's unchecked, if the job will stop if this method succeeds. It'll consider that to be the best method that works for this particular message. Filing to all targets, again, will either make copies or links based on the global filing mode settings. So to talk a little bit about what I'll call better practices, I don't want to go so far as to call these best practices because there's really a lot of flexibility here. It really determines, it's really determined on what your users are doing, what the particular business use cases are, what the needs are within the particular departments and so on. So in general, again, what I'll call a better practice recommendation is that we want to create duplicates for any kind of multi-tag filing methods. And again, the category example is the primary one for that. Or if I'm doing a search and I'm finding multiple multiple destinations. Again, our matter-centric design best practices say that you shouldn't have more than one workspace for any particular client matter. But let's say you have a distributed environment and you've got different workspaces in different environments, different regions of the world perhaps. Again, you have a choice here. You can say, I want to create the different physical copies so that we don't have LAN performance issues. Some people would say we're going to use the parallel workspace model and we're cross-provisioning shortcuts. Again, Workspace Manager can be used to address that, or EIM can do that initially simply by creating or filing the message in the primary database and then creating the shortcut links across databases to the remote locations. So again, there is some choice there. Creating links instead of physical copies. The presumption here is that the best or first method controls the metadata and security. And again, based on which methods of tagging, if you're using ePredict, for example, MAPI tags, subject line tags are highly reliable and highly specific in terms of that target. So that will say that's the best place. But if I also want to consider other filing methods, maybe the user has dragged and dropped the message into some other folders, maybe they've tagged it with some categories after it was sent or received, then I can use those secondary methods to create links to those secondary destinations rather than creating physical copies. And again, the issue here when we're talking about documents that are linked to multiple destinations is using the refiling module. The refiling module has what we call the accumulated security. So if I've got a document that I'm refiling that exists in multiple target destinations in Worksite, I can use the first folder's values, again considering that that's the best location. And if I'm refiling the security, accumulate the security, so if it's in multiple different workspaces with different ethical walls or combinations of security, I can combine that security to have the more restrictive security to make sure that single instance of the message that's referenced in multiple workspaces conforms to all of the different ethical walls that apply to that content. Workspace Manager can also be used to create duplicates. The provisioning functionality where we're adding documents to folders, basically generally by default we're linking documents to folders, but we can also create physical instances of documents or shortcuts to documents that span databases. So there are a lot of different things you can do with that to control how the content is worked with and stored in Worksite, again, based on different kinds of practice areas, different kinds of workspaces, or the same content in different phases of its life cycle. So the project items data, which basically stores the information about where a particular file is referenced within Worksite, is the core data that's used to drive that job and determine where that content is linked. So here what we're doing in the provisioning settings of a folder in the Workspace Manager job is to create a physical copy of that document. I can create copies of all versions, which you may or may not want to do. In general, with emails, you're not going to have multiple versions. But I can add the document, basically say, this document is referenced in these 10 different folders. I want to instead create a copy of this document, put it in that folder where there's a link right now, and then I can remove that redundant link or shortcut to that document that exists within that folder all in one pass. So it's very simple to switch from a linked to a duplicate model, a single instance with multiple links to single instances with no links using the provisioning capabilities of Workspace Manager. And obviously we'll talk about the reverse of this, going from a multiple copies to a linked model in a few minutes. So, perfect segue, getting rid of duplicates. So let's say I've got all these duplicates and I want to switch back to a model of having content that's linked, or at a minimum getting rid of the duplicates. So I have something weird with my animation there. So the first step is to do some analysis. We use some fairly complex SQL scripts to look at the database, see what's going on there. The scope of the analysis is critical. Right? Looking in the same folder, if I have multiple physical copies, multiple duplicates in the same folder, That's very easy to see. You can enhance the query a little bit to look at the tree ID structure of the workspace to do the deduplication within the workspace, and then just look at very raw, just at the entire database to see what kind of duplicates exist. Obviously, this will also get any orphan documents that are just floating around in the flat space of the database. It's also possible to do deduplication across databases, but that's really, really hard. I mean, again, it depends on your environment, how easy it is to do cross-server joins within your environment, how good your WAN links are, if that's applicable, because this is something that can really strain your system. So it is possible to do, but it has to be done very carefully and with a lot of testing and phases to make sure it's not going to have any kind of performance impact. Safety, again, is critical. How much metadata are we using to do cross-referencing? So again, message ID alone is one thing, but it may not by itself be safe. So we can use that as a way to get a sort of initial feel for what's going on, and then in general we want to introduce other metadata, the sent date, again, because the message is sent from a single server at one point in time, regardless of the number of recipients it's going to, that is going to be highly reliable in terms of making sure that all of the messages with a specific message ID are indeed instances of the same message. So there's a sample query. Wow, that was really cool. Sorry, just kidding. So what this query will do is give me this kind of information. This is a very simple query in terms of looking at duplicates that are within the same folder within WorkSite. This is what I call the sort of no-brainer configuration using minimal metadata. So what we're doing is creating a temporary table and doing a number of cross-selects here using this information. We're looking at message IDs that are not null. Sorry, I can't select that. There are bizarre situations where you can have messages that are imported into WorkSite that the message itself actually does not have a message ID. Rare, but it happens, and this is another thing that both HP, Autonomy Interwoven, and the DocAuto applications have evolved over the years to account for corrupt messages. Our Exchange importer can support messages that were actually converted CC mail messages. You know, all kinds of bizarre things that were converted from Lotus Notes, other email platforms, Gmail, you name it. You're not always going to have content that is going to conform to what you think the object model should be for that content. So you also have to have various degrees of safety in there. So here we're taking these results, getting the message ID and grouping by the message ID and the sent date, looking at the content in a particular folder or project. So again, anything that has a count of more than one. And then this is a query that's driving a Workspace Manager provisioning job. I'm looking at this data and getting everything that is greater than the first item. Right? So the first item, we'll sort this by create date. The first item will be the quote-unquote original, although because it's on the same folder, it really doesn't matter. And then we're using this to get all of the other items that we want to get rid of, all the other duplicates, and that's the Workspace Manager process. So here I'm doing it in batches of 10,000. That's somewhat arbitrary, but it lets you sort of monitor what's going on. And here also ordering by the document number is also a way of getting the items based on the first one that's imported. So that's something that would also correspond with create date of the message. So running that kind of query, and again with modifications, we can expand that to different scopes, you know, the same workspace, the same database, and so on. Adding additional cross-referencing metadata to isolate content by author, by how it was created, by client matter, whatever it is. So 35,000 duplicates in a 75 user firm, 600,000 in a 425 user firm, and then 200,000 in a 500 user firm. So that may seem bizarre that we have fewer in a firm that is larger, But really what we're seeing is that there's a vast range of how aggressively different firms are driving users to use or encouraging users to use different email management technologies. So you're going to see really no particular pattern, at least we're not seeing any particular pattern in terms of per user counts. Right? Power users in a small firm may have much larger volumes than more casual users in a large firm. So there's really no specific pattern there. So let's talk about the deduplication approach. Again, what you want to do is do safe, controlled deduplication of multiple emails in the same folder is the sort of easy, what we call the no-brainer way of doing it, right? Why would you possibly want multiple instances of the exact same message in the exact same folder? I don't know. There might be a reason. If you do, we could probably filter them out that way, but in general, in theory, I don't think there is a reason why you would possibly want that. Hypothetically, if you had different security on them, but again, you know, if you're using WorkSite in a particular way, refiling is going to strip that off. So there really are a lot of other best practices that would sort of fly in the face of the idea of having heterogeneous content that's really identical within the same folder in WorkSite. Same WorkSpace, again, there are arguably more situations here where you would want to have copies. A common example that we see is the desire to import content from different user mailboxes and mark it all private to that user. So you can have an email folder in a WorkSpace, and when you know, user X logs in, they see user X email folder underneath that, and then there's all their email, and it's all marked private to them. So they're happy with that. They have their own little stuff. They don't see anybody else's email folders. Nobody else sees theirs. But there may be 20 folders within that WorkSpace representing content that has been sourced from different authors that is all private to those individual authors. Again, it's kind of a bizarre use case, but we do see that not infrequently, I'll say. So looking at it within the same WorkSpace, you want to consider those different operational models and make sure that whatever kind of scoping you're doing allows those models to exist. Obviously, if you have refiling module and you can do the accumulated security, it makes it very easy to deduplicate that regardless and yet still have that content respect the security. Again, the issue there is that the author of the content can only be a single value on the message, so you may have to create security ACLs explicitly on the folders to allow other users to see the message. Then, of course, some people say, well, then the users are going to see who else had the message, but everybody can see who had the message in the first place because of how it was imported and what addresses were on the message. So I don't know, that's kind of a spurious argument. So checking the security, again, intra and inter WorkSpace, within the same WorkSpace, between WorkSpaces, you need to be careful of that. Determining which one is the original, right? In the query that I showed, we're going by the document number. Again, that's a very sort of facile way of looking at it, but a pretty good identifier. The refiling module supports refiling metadata based on the first message or the first item or the last item. Some people feel that, you know, well, we did our import and everything got kind of arbitrarily put in particular destinations, and it's the user's remediation operations over the life cycle of the content that is, quote unquote, improving how the content is being stored. So we actually want to use the last destination or the last folder that the message was added to rather than the first. That's perfectly fine. Again, we can treat different subsets of content different ways depending on how you want to slice and dice that. And then there are other methods. You know, people can get down to very granular approaches here, saying, well, user X was really good and meticulous about how they filed stuff, so I want to give preference to anything where they have a history event on the content, or they were the last user or operator on the content. So again, if you want to go nuts with it, we can get down to very, very tight use cases in terms of how we're improving the quality of this content in terms of the metadata and security. So in general, what you want to do is schedule jobs, again, using the DocAuto Server platform to do the duplication or deduplication. WorkSpace Manager, we have a fairly simple process of doing the deduplication, but then also using provisioning to create duplicates if you want, archiving to move content to an archive or a secondary database, and as part of that process, distill it down to the single instance. Again, once it's in archive, having a single instance that's linked to multiple different destinations that are all hypothetically archived or dead doesn't really matter because users generally aren't going to be playing in that sandbox anyway. So again, based on your business processes and your basic philosophy and theory of how these things should be working, we can have the different processes set up at different times of the content lifecycle. Refiling module, also the accumulated security, respecting content that's in multiple ethical walls, covered by multiple ethical walls, also fairly simple to set up. So again, sample approach for doing deduplication. We have a process, again, automated jobs that create a temporary holding workspace. We add, based on this query like the one I showed, 10,000 duplicates at a time. Again, skipping the first one because that's quote-unquote the good one. Deleting the workspace and all of its content. Repeat as necessary. So again, pretty simple, pretty straightforward. Generally something that you don't have to run all the time. Again, if you've got 600,000 or 12 million, it's going to take a while to crank through that process. Once you get down to a sort of normal production mode, you may decide you want to do this once a month, once a week, whatever it is. The nice thing about this approach here is that I can run step one and then just look at what's in that workspace and do a little reality check on it. So it's very easy to have a comfort level that you're good with as part of these procedures. It's very simple to have eyes on to see what's going on. If you don't want to do 10,000 duplicates at a time, we can start with 100 or 1,000 or whatever it is. So we can run the job, phase one, phase two, see what's going on. Yep, that's right, that's what we want. And then move on to phase three, which is obviously the chainsaw. If you don't like that, we can actually do things where we do a phased process where instead of deleting the workspace, we can copy it to an archive as a holding area. Again, using WorkSpace Manager, and if for some reason you're not comfortable with it, we can move it right back. So it's all about getting comfortable with the process, making sure that we're addressing everything that you need to do to satisfy your business. And again, just some little screenshot there from the DocAuto server where we're actually scheduling this kind of change. So how do we improve the situation moving forward? If you're using the EIM, the Exchange Importer module, look at your filing methods, make sure you're doing what's appropriate for the different combination of methods that you're using. Make sure your worksite server is configured correctly. Again, the version that you're on and what the settings are will be critical to that because the server behaves different ways in different versions. Also making sure that the client-side settings are correct, looking at these history events, looking at the applications that the users are using, looking at the different processes that are running, how they're creating the duplicates, and user education, right? I mean, we have firms sometimes that freak out and say, oh, this message is in 12 different workspaces, I have these duplicates. No, it's only one message, but it's linked to 12 different folders. Right, so making sure that people aren't freaking out about something that is really under control. So our professional services team can help with all aspects of this, checking to see, I won't say whether or not you have a problem, but how big the problem is, coming up with various recommendations, maybe simple ways to remediate or lessen the situation, and then various ways of improving the situation, doing different things based on content lifecycle, user training, ongoing planning, and so on. And I think that's about all the time that I had. I hope everyone enjoyed what we call the DocAuto fire hose here. If you do have any questions or want to follow up in any way, please feel free to reach out to us. Thank you all for attending, and have a good day.